All right, and welcome to another episode of Charles' Weekly Parti. I'm Charles, your host, and I'm back with the latest and greatest from Apple after their event last week. But before I can get started, let's roll the intro. Okay, so I mentioned last episode that I would be taking a look at what Apple had to announce in their event and conveying both the details of the event and my thoughts over to you. So, focusing on the Apple event, overall, I thought it was an interesting experience. With the recent years with COVID, the video transitions have been something of a degree of interest, and they've had production locations that aren't just the stage of the Steve Jobs Theater, a venue that I explored back in season 21. So, looking around at it, I liked the way the production went through, and my thoughts on it, well, I'm glad the production went pretty well because I have a lot of mixed feelings about everything that Apple announced, which for me is perfectly normal and for most people is perfectly normal as well. So, for those of you who haven't necessarily gotten the chance to see or watch or listen to episodes where I go over a tech event, what ends up happening is that I sit down and discuss what's going on, or I try and give a basic breakdown of what was talked about, and I try and keep it to simple breakdown in my thoughts, because if I was just repeating everything that they were saying, then it's a waste of my time and yours to listen to the podcast. I'd just send you over to listen to or watch the event. So for the episodes, what ends up happening is I give the quick breakdown, talk about the different things, and I intersperse my personal thoughts on it and what it means in greater sort of context. Because sure, you can get a lot of stuff from the event, but sometimes it's nicer to see certain little things about the event, and it's nicer to know that maybe something was a little bit too sugar-coated in the event and needs to be clarified. And this can happen with multiple different tech events throughout the year, so not just Apple. But for the purposes of my episode today, I'm going to be going in pretty much the order that Apple went in. So they started off talking a little bit about Apple TV, so they're bringing Apple TV Plus. So they are bringing some new programming in, and I think Friday Night Baseball. So just to be clear, Apple TV and Apple TV Plus are two different things. Apple TV is an app or a set-top box, and Apple TV Plus is a service. So Apple TV Plus will be getting some new programming, and I believe the going rate for that is $5 a month. So not too bad, but I'm not going to say that there's I currently have that as one of my personal subscriptions. So whether I'm not a huge baseball fan, maybe I have the subscription, so maybe I'll put it on or watch a little bit of baseball. I don't know. I haven't necessarily had the opportunity or reason to try, but we shall see. And I'll just have to see how I enjoy that. But they have some other new programming that's exclusive to Apple TV Plus, and to me, I think that's the long and shorts of that little short update. Moving right along, the iPhone got a little bit of an update. So for the iPhone 13 and 13 Pro, there are two new colors. Each line has a new color. So iPhone 13 is now available in green, and iPhone 13 Pro is available in an alpine green. While the name is just a little bit different, and obviously alpine green sounds a little bit more special than just green, The Pro will have a little bit of a different finish to it because from Apple's perspective, it's a more premium phone, so it needs to have a little bit more of a premium look and feel. Otherwise, people aren't going to be happy paying the extraordinary price tag, and I think the Pro costs, depending on the phone you get, you can possibly spend more on it than you might spend on a new laptop. But continuing in the iPhone realm, the iPhone SE has received an update. So the iPhone SE will now feature the A15 Bionic chip. It is IP67 water resistant with Touch ID, so basically it looks like it's in the shell and chassis look of an iPhone 8 with the technology of a more recent phone. So that being said, they did add the Gorilla Glass, or is it Gorilla Glass? I think it's Gorilla Glass, but apologies if I'm wrong on that. But they have the tough glass on the phone, so it supports wireless charging on the back, but not MagSafe like the iPhone 13 and 13 Pro do. And I think the 12s do as well. So, but once again, don't quote me on that because I'm not entirely sure. The iPhone SE, I think this is the 3rd generation, supports portrait mode and portrait lighting, as well as having the other computational photography features that you might be used to. The screen is 4.7 inches and it has Smart HDR4. The battery life theoretically got a little bit of a bump to it. And because when I mentioned this has Touch ID and iPhone 8, yes, this does actually have a home button as well. Also worth noting out, the colors it comes in are Midnight, which is a really dark gray. I think somewhere in between dark gray and black. Starlight, which is a slightly softer toned white, and Product Red, which, as the name might suggest, is red. So the iPhone SE starts at $429, and if you max out the options, it can cost you up to $579. And the options that it has are only storage based, so not as much to choose from in there. So thoughts on it? It's a little bit more expensive, and personally, I would have liked it if they had added MagSafe into it, because that's something that's becoming a big part of today's sort of iPhone culture. And if Apple wants to sort of standardize their wireless chargers, they really should have had this support MagSafe. So don't know why that didn't happen, but I guess that is what it is. And this also means that the previous iPhone SE is discontinued. However, by discontinued, I just mean that it's no longer available for sale brand new from Apple. That being said, it should still be receiving software updates for a while yet, because I think it was released either 2 or 3 years ago. Almost forgot to mention, this new one does feature 5G, which it will do a great deal for the longevity of it. For those of you who might not know, the first iPhone featured 3G. And in order to sort of facilitate the transition to a 5G dominant market, 3G is slowly being discontinued throughout this year by different cell companies. So what that means is that despite the fact that the software is no longer going to be up to date, your really old iPhones will no longer be able to make and receive calls. So they will truly be something for the antique drawer. So thoughts on it? It's a nice little phone. So if you're getting into the ecosystem, it's not a bad spot to start. But personally, I think Apple could have done a little bit more to it, made it a little bit better and possibly giving it a sort of longer longevity. Not longer longevity, but bringing it sort of up to par with their flagship phones. So the fact that it's still using the iPhone 8 chassis, definitely I have mixed feelings on that. The other thing is that the price has been bumped. It used to start at $399, now it starts at $429. So whether or not inflation is playing any part of this, not entirely sure, but all I can say is it is $30 more expensive. That being said, the A15 Bionic is the latest and greatest chip. So despite what it looks like, or the fact that it doesn't have MagSafe, it does have the capability, or the physical computing capability of the more recent iPhones. Yeah. As much as I'd like to continue talking about the iPhone, I think it's about time that I shift towards the iPad Air, because I know there's a topic that I'd really like to talk about towards the end of the episode that's probably going to take a hot minute. So for the iPad Air, as you might have guessed, I had a feeling when I saw that they were talking about the Air that they would be doing this, but my suspicions were confirmed shortly into the event, where, let's see, if you haven't guessed it by now, I'm about to reveal it. They added the M1 chip to the iPad Air. So because of that, the CPU is 60% faster than it had previously. I think it should have 8 gigabytes of memory if it's using the M1. I'm not entirely sure on this, so have to see little bits of performance specs on that. Features there: True Tone display. The enclosure is done in 100% recycled aluminum, so kudos to Apple on that. They've been trying to push their products towards being entirely carbon neutral by 2030, so glad they're getting a little bit closer on that. Supports Touch ID on the button you use to wake it up, because the iPad Air form factor no longer supports the home button. So at this point, the only currently released, the up-to-date things that Apple has that have the home button are the base level iPad and the iPhone SE. USB-C is not Thunderbolt, but it is 2 times faster, giving it up to, I believe, 10 gigabits a second on transfer speed. They've also finally finished the addition of Center Stage to their iPads and brought the Center Stage feature to the iPad Air. If you get a cellular-enabled model, you can get 5G on this particular iPad. The display is a liquid retina display. If you are getting an Apple Pencil for this supports the 2nd generation Apple Pencil. So if you're not familiar with that, if you get an iPad and an Apple Pencil, Apple has 2 versions of the Pencil, Generation 1 and Generation 2. Everything except, the general rule of thumb is if it has a home button, it takes the first generation. If it does not have the home button, it has USB-C port on it, it will take the 2nd generation, because that magnetically attaches for charging. The back camera is a 12 megapixel camera, and it works with the Magic Keyboard. So if you want to get it, the colors come in space gray, pink, purple, blue, and starlight. And it should be noted the purple is very similar to the purple on the iPhone that they did a couple years back, which looks to me more like a lavender than a purple, but I digress. The blue is also a relatively light tone as well, and starlight basically matches the iPhone SE. Now, if you decide that you want to get the iPad Air, the entry price is $599, and it caps out at $899. So personally, my thoughts on this are that I don't think the price point is increased, and the fact that they're bringing M1 to it is really good. But I also feel like it should be noted that if this costs $600 to get the M1 chip in it, right now their base level iPad costs $329. I guess the best way to put this is trying to figure out, yeah, it'll make the iPad a lot better, and I think it's very similar form factor. If anything, the iPad Air probably has a slightly larger screen to it, but I think it comes down to personal choice. So if you're not planning on doing much, then I would say you don't need to necessarily work with this or upgrade to the M1. If you are going to be pushing your iPad a little bit forward, further, doing more multitasking type purposes, then you might find it beneficial to go and get the iPad Air. Obviously, if you need the top-end performance, then you'd have to go for the iPad Pro. So, right, my concern is that this is, I think, $300 cheaper than the iPad Pro. And personally, I think it's getting a little bit too close to where the iPad Pro's performance is. Because just looking at it, it has the M1. The real benefit, if you spend the $300 more, is you get the iPad Pro, and I think the smaller one uses liquid Retina display. I know the 12.9-inch one contains the M1, but also features an XDR display in it. So realistically speaking, and having a lot more screen real estate. So personally, I don't know where Apple's headed on this, but I think part of what this is doing is also making it so that I think the pricing on the iPad Pro is now a little bit too expensive for what it is. Oh, and that's the base price. That's before you get into storage options. So it should be noted out that the highest priced features both, I believe, features cellular and the highest storage option. Now I'd like to go on to the star of the event, the Mac Studio. So first and foremost, when Apple first started talking about this, they didn't dive straight into the Mac Studio. Instead, they started talking about the transition to Apple Silicon. The transition to Apple Silicon, the M1 chip was their new very high-powered chip. And then with the two MacBook Pro models announced last year, they unveiled the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. Now, the name M1 Max would suggest that that was the maximum performance of the chip. However, Apple had a card up its sleeve on this, and they revealed this during the event. Evidently, the M1 Max features a little piece at the bottom of it that allows it to be attached to another M1 Max and fused together in order to make a to basically double the performance of the M1 Max. And the reason they wanted to do this was simple. For software developing, doing this type of fusion would enable the programs to see one processing unit instead of two. Because if you have two of them separated, you have a little bit more latency, and you have And you have the fact that the computer programs might not see it as being one chip. The other thing with possibly combining things is that many people noted out, and I think myself included, that the M1 Max was getting to the size where making it bigger didn't do any benefit couldn't really serve any benefit, because silicon does have some limitations in how big the wafer size can be. So once you get to a certain point, it becomes completely uneconomical to produce the silicon for the chips themselves. But when they said that you could fuse the two together, I don't mean you can't just take the two in your hands and shove them together. They have to be fused together. But they have a way of doing it to be able to so as they produce the Max chips, they can fuse two together to produce an M1 Ultra. So hopefully next year they don't go and say, oh, by the way, we figured out there's a second one on the M1 Max that allows it to be combined to two M1 Maxes at one time, making a M1 Super Ultra or something. But I think that's going a little bit far, hopefully. But what Apple does, we will have yet to see. But the M1 Ultra is the latest and greatest in the transition to Apple Silicon. And what better way to say we made one of the most powerful processors that you could buy for a consumer than to put it into a special new computer. And that is exactly what they did with the Mac Studio. Personally, I can't stand the way this thing looks. I honestly can't. It has the same footprint of a Mac Mini. And the Mac Mini has had that style for several years. I have a circa 2012 Mac Mini. And you know what? It has the exact same shape. If you put the two right next to each other, unless you look at the backs of them, you are not going to be able to tell which of them has the M1 chip in it and which one is no longer receiving software updates. But I digress. So instead of being, I think it was a little over an inch tall, instead of being about an inch or so tall, it's now 3.7 inches tall. Besides the fact that it looks like someone elongated it, the front of the computer features two USB-C ports or Thunderbolt ports, depending on which chip you get, and an SDXC card slot. So the Mac Studio comes with either an M1 Max or an M1 Ultra. So if you get the M1 Max, you have up to 400 gigabytes a second memory bandwidth, and with the M1 Ultra, you get up to 800 gigabytes a second of memory bandwidth, because if you're putting two chips together, you basically double it. They've also pointed out that with the M1 Ultra, they can now support up to 128 gigabytes of unified memory. So the storage performance is listed at 7.4 gigabytes a second, although some third-party reports state that the performance is not 100% honest. So I haven't done a lot of diving into that, but it is worthy of noting out on a desktop processor that if it is sort of making it look faster than it is, that data that is looking like it's been written but is in a temporary cache, if your power goes out, which is a concern on a desktop computer, you might be in a little spot of trouble, especially if you haven't especially if you're just in the process of saving your work. So advice for that: if you're going to be getting this computer, it's expensive enough that you can probably spend another little bit of cash to get a UPS, so an uninterruptible power supply. And that way you'll be able to, if the power goes out, have a little bit of time to make sure everything's actually saved, and then shut the computer down so that you don't lose any work. Storage space-wise, it is able to support up to 8 terabytes of internal storage. Supports Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.0. The Ethernet is 10 gigabits by default. There are 4 USB Type-C and Thunderbolt 4 ports on the back. There's an HDMI slot, 2 USB-A slots, which is actually interesting, and a headphone port, which I'm curious as to why they placed on the back, but okay. In my opinion, you could have pulled off a traditional desktop move and put one on the back and one on the front. So that way, if you're plugging in headphones, which may have only yay long of a cord, you can easily you're not yanking the cord out every time. Or if you want to plug in speakers and you don't need the extra wire running across your desk just to run behind the thing, then you can plug it in the back one. But that's just my personal opinion. I feel like I should note that each piece has a little bit of, that this whole thing has a little bit of a dirty secret to it. And that secret is, well, I think I've made this aware in the past, but it's important to note out. So the little sort of secret that this has, and by secret I mean something that they're not advertising, but many people have pointed out, myself included, worthy of noting. So the big problem with the entire new generations of Macs with their Apple Silicon is that the memory and the storage cannot be upgraded after the fact. And personally, I find that to be quite annoying because, first and foremost, Apple does charge a premium for these two capabilities. So I believe the RAM upgrade, so if you were to buy the, or go for the M1 Ultra, you could either get 64 gigabytes of memory, or you could pay an additional $800 to double that to 128 gigs. For reference, because I have purchased 64 gigabytes of memory in one of the most expensive, in the second most expensive configuration you could, and doing so set me back less than $300. So the fact that Apple is charging more than twice that, I think is way far out of whack. And the memory that I got was one of the fastest memory speeds available. So I'll have to look and see what benchmarks provide, but my sneaking suspicion is that the performance is probably going to be on par, which means that you're not only paying an upcharge, you are paying a massive upcharge for the extra memory. And personally, I have a slight problem with that, because if you look at it, you're in a position where you have to get the specs you want permanently set off at the bat. Because as Apple said, to make everything faster, everything's basically soldered on the motherboard, so it isn't soldered right next to each other, so they aren't going all the way across the board for preventing latency. However, the speed is coming at the cost of future upgradability. So that is one thing to note. So to all of Apple's bashing of PCs, they overlooked two very critical pieces, which is that A, the Macs cannot currently run Windows on them, which means if you need to use software for Windows, architecture being one of those fields that does use, there are some programs that are supported on both, but one of the biggest architectural programs, Autodesk Revit, is only supported on Windows. If you do not have Windows, you can't run the software. And to that point, you can, personally, the amount that they want to charge for this, I could probably get a PC providing relatively equivalent performance for less. But that has the opposite problem of if you need Mac OS for something, well, you need the Mac. So it's sort of like the catch-22 of computers. And to some degree, it's both funny and sad at the same time. Now, on to pricing, which, not to brag, but I predicted sort of spot on during the event. The M1, the Mac Studio starts at $19.99, and that is not $19.99 or $20. That is $1,999. That features the M1 Max and certain base capacity pieces. I don't remember the minimum memory configuration, but I think it's probably either 16 or 32. Now, if you want to double that cost, funny, double the CPU, double the cost, you can get the M1 Ultra, which starts off with 64 gigabytes of memory, 20 cores of CPU, 48 core GPU, 32 core neural engine, and a 1 terabyte SSD. And I know, personally speaking, that 1 terabyte only gets you so far. In fact, I think this podcast has accounted for over a terabyte worth of storage space to date. So the top of the line Mac Studio will set you back $8,000. Well, technically one less, so $7,999 or $79,999. And the benefits to that are you get 64 cores in the GPU, you get 8 terabytes of SSD storage, and 128 gigabytes of memory. And yes, the 8 terabytes of internal SSD storage costs $2,200. The processor upgrade was to bring the GPU up to 64 cores is $1,000 on its own. And I will say right now, storage-wise, for comparison's sake, not that you could necessarily fit all of it, but but to the best of my knowledge, for SSD storage, if you're getting higher capacity drives, it comes at roughly a cost of $100 a terabyte. So that means for that price, you should be able to get 22 terabytes worth of storage, and you're only getting 8. So that's just another premium upcharge for that. And personally, I have mixed feelings on that, because if it's going to be a desktop, it is a desktop computer. So at that point, personally, I would say if you're going to be running enough stuff on the computer at the time, yeah, you can get a little bit of a memory upgrade, but instead of spending a lot of the money on the internal SSD, I would spend it on either getting one or more external SSDs, possibly creating a network storage device to hook up to it. Might have a little bit more latency, but if you need more storage or more bang for the buck on the storage, it comes at the cost of latency, but you could probably get yourself an external storage solution that holds the 8 terabytes for significantly less than that. So just so you're aware. So the thoughts on that are completely interspersed through it. I think I've made my position quite clear on a couple of the things. So that being said, the fact that this can drive, I think either 3 or 4 Pro Display XDRs is quite impressive. I think 3 Pro XDRs and a 4K screen. Another display it can support is the Studio Display. And to sort of point out something that Apple also pointed out during their event. The whole point of the Studio, Mac Studio and the Studio Display, according to Apple, was to try and make a more loose and free solution for those people who have a studio environment and would like as much performance as they can. However, it should also be noted that they said they haven't come up with a replacement for the Mac Pro yet. So interested to see where that goes, and my fingers are crossed that the Mac Pro can be something that can be physically upgraded. I really hope. Anyway, the Studio Display is a 27-inch 5K Retina display with a 12-megapixel ultra-wide camera with center stage integrated into it, as well as 6 speakers for the sound system that support spatial audio, USB-C ports on the back that are capable of charging a MacBook should you hook one up to it, 600 nits worth of brightness. Evidently it works with Mac OS, which basically means that the brightness control will change the brightness as well as the volume control on the Studio Display. What else is there? And then they have 3 stand options, so you can get a regular sort of stand that tilts up to a 30-degree viewing angle. You can get a tilt and height adjustable stand, or you can get a VESA mount. And you do have to choose that at ordering. You can't choose that later on down the line. So personally, kudos to Apple for putting a webcam in. I'm curious to know what would happen if you got 3 of these displays and hooked it up to your Studio Mac. If you turn on the webcam, which one comes on? Or do you get alternating views or view from all angles of your face? More on the lines of interesting questions, but considering I'm not going to be buckling out a bunch of money for this display because the display starts at $1,600, I think it's safe to say I can only think and wonder on that. You can also get the nano textured glass option, which costs an additional $300, but makes it so that if you're in a brighter environment, it scatters light to reduce glare. Now, price-wise, I mentioned it starts at $1,599 or pretty close to $1,600, off by $1. If you want the nano textured glass, that's an additional $300. And if you want the tilt and height adjustable stand, which for full knowledge does not support rotation, evidently that costs an additional $600. You can get that. But it is important to note out that whichever one you get, you have to choose the mounting option at checkout because you can't change that down the line, which personally I feel like that's a little bit of a shortcoming on Apple's part, because I know sometimes you might want one stand option, but you want to have the future capability of putting it on a display arm. But if you had to make that choice, personally, I would go for the VESA mount, because if you ever end up needing to rotate the display, you're going to be grateful for it. And I wish personally just that the regular stand was detachable, or possibly, I don't know, make a VESA mount, or make a stand that supports VESA mounting. But those are just some personal thoughts on it. And I think to some degree putting a little bit too much form over function and the VESA mount doesn't look attractive, but hopefully that's not visible on however you decide to mount your display. But with that, that's going to conclude today's episode. I do hope you've enjoyed it, because I certainly enjoyed watching the event and getting to explore the latest and greatest on Apple's products offerings. If you did enjoy this episode, please subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. you can go to anchor.fm/weeklyparti, where you can listen to any previous episode as well as interacting with voice messages. Also, while you're there, you can support the podcast, which helps out a lot. For my Parti for the week, I'm realizing I skipped over, is just looking at how amazing technology is getting to be, but at the same time realizing it comes at a cost. And that cost is that, what's the name for it? The cost for it is, how do I put it? You're getting speed at the cost of future upgradability, and personally, I think Apple would be doing everyone a favor if they could add the option for future upgradability and serviceability, because part of the commitment to the environment is making sure that your entire computer doesn't become e-waste if one component dies. I had on my desktop computer this past year, I had the GPU decide to fail on me. And if that GPU had been built into the computer and not upgradable, my entire desktop would have been a gigantic bucket of e-waste. However, because it is a traditional desktop computer, I was able to get an older card to be able to hold me over and put that in and get that working without any huge problems. Speaking of Apple, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to leave a review. And if you want to, you can usually see the action on YouTube. I know last week I was on location, so I was not able to upload a video for that, but I will be able to do that today. So, take care. Have a nice week. See you next time. Roll the outro.